There are more seats in the first 3 rows. Free seats in the first 3 rows. I could also There are more seats over here in the first rows for people searching. Awesome. Okay, I guess we start. So, the last presentation before the coffee. I take this up now. So, I would like to present you Billy. Interesting about him, we asked all our speakers what their profession is. And he came back with troublemaker. And we said, okay, good, that's interesting. Can we put this on the website? And he said, yeah, of course. So when you go his speaker profile, you will see troublemaker there. And I have to say, I'm really interested in what a troublemaker's presentation is. So we're really happy to have Billy here. Billy, free on stage.
Troublemaker. Well, troublemaker is not so much my profession as it is my personality that gets imposed on whatever job that I have. But when you run your own small consulting company, you can call yourself anything you like. I figured that out a long time ago. So that's why I use troublemaker. First of all, let me say, I'm thrilled to be here. I have long wanted to visit, and I appreciate the conference organizers giving me a chance to come here. Most of you probably do not know who I am because I've spent most of my career in the Microsoft side of things. If you live over there, you might have seen some of my books, and I do a lot of things in conferences. But I've spent most of my time over there, though the big difference of me and most of the people there is that I've always been focused on user interface design, even back in DOS-based, character-based screens. You realize how far back I go from my hair, I hope. Should we play a guessing game? When do you think I learned to write code, learned to program? Any guesses? Punch cards, that's right, 1973 on punch cards. So in the DOS world, you wouldn't think that you would worry about design there, but actually you do. It's very important when you have such restricted capabilities to show the user. So I always spent time on that side of the development process. But let's be honest, in the Microsoft world, that was never much of a priority, was it? So I spent 3/4 of my time. You can laugh about it. We're fine with that. So I spent about 3/4 of my time mostly doing development. But about 5 years ago, when it became obvious that the world was changing, I began to switch much more heavily into the design-related aspects of software development. And now I spend perhaps 2/3 of my time doing that sort of thing. I still do some development, so I live on the edge between the two worlds. And I spend a lot of time trying to help developers understand something about the way their world is changing. How many of you primarily consider development as your job, that you write code and produce software as your job? Yeah, that's 3/4 of you. How many of you consider yourself designers, that that's your primary job? And that's about 1/3. So for those of you who are in the design world, especially if you come from the web world, I think you'll find some things here that are interesting. But to be honest, my content tends, because I come from the Microsoft world, tends to be focused expecting that the developers in the audience do not do a lot of work in this area. So I may say some things that for you design people you think are fairly prosaic, but we shall see. Well, I've always felt lonely in the Microsoft world with my focus on design, but you know, they are catching up with me. This was the sign at the Build conference at the Anaheim Convention Center almost exactly 1 year ago when they rolled out Windows 8. Use what you know, do what you've always imagined. Now, imagination is probably not a characteristic you associate typically with the Microsoft ecosystem. I know I don't. But they have been forced to face the realities of the modern world, as in fact I think all software developers need to face them. And Microsoft realizes, because they lived through the same period that I did, that we are in a period of major transition. The last period of comparable transition was the 1980s. Realize, in 1985, IBM ruled the IT industry. Mainframes, minis, PCs, software. For those of you who did not live in that era, you had no idea how dominant IBM was. They dominated the industry more than any single company today. That was 1985. By 1995, IBM was irrelevant in terms of setting the direction of the industry. They reinvented themselves. They're still a player, but they lost that dominance and they lost the ability to direct the industry in only 10 years. Microsoft realizes it could happen to them. And they realize that the situation is fairly similar. You look at the 1980s and the fact that we had PCs, new devices. PCs didn't come in because the IT guys wanted them. PCs came in because people brought them in and said, we're going to use them. Now, let's connect them somehow. And we got networks, and we got graphical user interfaces to change interaction patterns. And we got the rise of the internet to start connecting them all together. Well, look how that compares to today. We've got a whole lot of new devices. We've got new ways to interact with those devices with touch computing. We've got connectivity we just expect to be on all the time. We're moving from a model in which we use routine business storage to cloud storage. People just expect their stuff to be up there in the cloud somewhere. These factors are changing the world of development just as much as the factors in the 80s, and Microsoft understands that if they're not able to cope with these changes and adapt their own products, that they will be in the same situation as IBM. These are the kinds of products that have changed the way we look at things. Started, of course, with some of the early Apple devices. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the iPad has had a tremendous influence in business software. The Kindle Fire has changed a lot of things. I don't know how popular it is here in America. It's hugely popular. The Kindle is a hugely popular device for reading. And even Microsoft is working to become a player here. The Windows Phone is actually a pretty good product. If you don't happen to have it, it's actually not a bad phone at all. I think it compares very, very favorably with the iPhone. In general, if I had to sum up where we are, the way user expectations are changing and how we have to respond or be replaced, then I would sum it up this way. For the history of software development, as long as I've been in it, it was enough just to make something possible. If you could write code to make something happen, you were successful. But now success also depends on making things easy, because that's what people expect. Now, we're not really ready for this so much because we had a lot of excuses for doing things the way we did in the past. Most of our technologies just kind of pushed us down a certain path. We tended to end up with these rectangular interfaces because that's what the technologies expected us to do. We developed kind of a habit, a way of thinking, a cage, so to speak, that we still live in. We tend to think, most developers, no matter what technology they use, tend to think that you design a user interface by dividing a screen up into rectangles and pouring something into every rectangle. And the world has moved well beyond that. Developers sense that they have to change. They don't really know how to change, though. The problem that I see, I don't know how things are in the rest of the industry, but in the Microsoft world, one of the big problems we have is substance abuse. Do you know that English term? Drug addiction? But the thing is that the substance that developers tend to be addicted to is computer code. That's what they like to do. If their preference is to keep writing code, how many of you got into this business because you enjoyed the process of writing code? Okay, how many of you don't like writing code? Well, then why are you, unless you're a designer, why are you in the business? See, the first round, you didn't want to admit it, right? Because you knew I was going to call you a substance abuser if you said, well, no, some people like to write code, but they can leave it behind if they need to. I can tell you how to find out. If you're really an addict, here's how you find out. Have you ever been in a meeting where someone was describing something new the software needed to do, or perhaps a brand new system that was to be produced? And you listen for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then you have tuned out the person talking because you're already coding the solution in your head. Okay, I hear laughter, and I know what that means. Those of you who have done that are addicts. You are addicted to writing code. But it is a controllable addiction, I think, for the most part. And you need to control it if you're going to live and work in this new ecosystem. I mean, some people believe, gosh, it's okay to just do, we're always going to need code. I can just keep doing what I'm doing now, and things will be fine. Well, you know what? Those COBOL guys back in the 1980s thought the same thing. So I wouldn't be too sure about it if I were you. Where are those guys today? I'm assuming you do want to go forward and you want to adapt to some of the changes. Now, because of the addiction problems, the most common mistake I see developers make as they try to enter this world is they assume that better design primarily means better cosmetics. That is a widespread misconception in my world. I don't know how widespread it is in other parts of the industry. Because developers don't really want to lose that addiction. They would like to avoid taking responsibility for better user interfaces, so some of them think it's enough to just make them look better. And they can delegate that to a graphic artist or some other person that works on cosmetics. I see this a lot in the web world too, that just making it pretty is considered to be enough. Well, pretty is important. I do not wish to say that cosmetics don't matter. They absolutely do matter. There is a reason they do not put ugly people on magazine covers. The first impression when you see a magazine cover is that if it looks nice, if the person looks not pretty, attractive, then you tend to be drawn to that. That is a natural human tendency. Do you know what the research says? How many seconds it takes you to form a first impression of a person? 5 seconds is typical. And what else do you judge on except for cosmetics, appearance? So certainly appearance is important. It's so important to the magazine people, they enhance it. These people don't really look that good, do they? And sometimes they even go too far. Look at that. Look at the one up at the top, second from the left. I'm sorry. Her stomach doesn't really look like that. I know better. Among other things I've done in the world, before I got into software for full time, I went to medical school for a year. I know a little bit about human anatomy. So cosmetics are important, but cosmetics are not enough. And I want to show a counterexample to demonstrate to you that cosmetics are not enough. There is a program that was installed on my computer when I got it called Connexent Smart Audio. I don't know if any of you have ThinkPads and have ever seen this software. Let me show it to you now. Which side is this on? Is it on? No. Let's see if I can't get you up here. Come on. Did it come up? No. Hang on. There it is. On that side or that's on the other side? All right, good. All right, now this is some beautiful software. I'm telling you this stuff absolutely looks great, doesn't it? The problem with it is this. I have no idea what it's doing. Look at that. So now it's in classic mode, and there's these wonderful swirly things here, and there are these red and blue buttons. What does that do? What does that mean? I have no idea what that's doing. And multi-stream, what does that mean? Let's punch it and find out. Oh, it thinks, and it thinks. It's slow, it's thinking. And then, well, I've got the buttons again, but I don't have a clue. And look at this thing up here. You probably think that that's a way to minimize the application, don't you? No, see, that's their menu. They just put it in a really stupid place. This thing is just a train wreck of bad user experience. Yet it's beautiful. And I hope that helps you understand that cosmetics alone are not enough to make software adequate in this new era that we live in. There's, in the USA, I have another example that I tend to show. There is a company we have there called AT&T, which used to stand for American Telephone and Telegraph. And this is their website. We don't have any Americans here with AT&T, do we? See, usually 1/3 of my audience will say, yes, despite the fact that this website is quite well designed from a cosmetic standpoint, it absolutely sucks toxic waste from a user experience standpoint. I've used these people for years, and I loathe every time I go to this website. So they're certainly, we can't just depend on cosmetics. I see this sometimes in business software. This was a competitor to something I'm going to show you in a few moments, a package for temporary staffing management. The cosmetics here are not too bad, but this was written in some of the latest technologies, user interface technologies on the Microsoft world. XAML is the technology used. And yet the design is fundamentally the same as it would have been in any older technology. There isn't anything about the user experience that takes advantage of what new technologies can do. All they did was take an old user interface and put some pretty colors and some nice graphics on it. So that's the first mistake that I try to convince developers not to make. I try to help them understand that there are limits to what cosmetics can do. It doesn't matter how nicely done the cosmetics are if it's a pig underneath. And that smart audio product is a pig, I'll tell you that, right? It's a very beautiful pig, but it's still a pig. So I try to convince them, developers, not to just depend on cosmetics and to try to break out. It's hard for them to do it. Sometimes they tend to stick in ruts. They tend to want to do things the way they have for some long period of time. And so sometimes I tend to scare them a little bit because I think the fear is justified. Where are those COBOL guys today? I'm serious. I tried to take teams of COBOL developers and put them into the modern world in the 1990s. And maybe 1/3 of them made the transition. Their thought patterns were in such ruts that they couldn't think about how development could be done dramatically differently than what they'd always done in the past. And that leads to some really big issues because there are big risks involved. Let me tell you about one from my personal perspective in Nashville, Tennessee. This is our beautiful skyline there. And what's Nashville famous for? They even know that in Zurich, don't they? See, he said Elvis. That is the biggest pet peeve for Nashvillians. Elvis did not live in Nashville. Elvis lived in Memphis, which is 3 hours away. So if you come to Nashville and you stop me on the street and say, would you tell me where Elvis's house, Graceland, is? What I will tell you to do is get on Interstate 40 and go west, and you'll see the signs. I won't tell you it's 3 hours later. No, Nashville, Tennessee. See, in Norway, they listen to a lot of country music. Does no one here listen to country music? No? Oh, some people do. I see a few nods. Nashville that's where we make it. Country music has been a huge industry there for decades. Not just country music, but all kinds of music. Musicians like Peter Frampton, for example, have lived there for a long, long time. A lot of the bands that you listen to very likely have studios and residences in Nashville. Well, on Music Row in Nashville, they've been in the music business for many decades, making lots and lots of money. Some of the very large companies in the music industry are located there. I have traveled all over the world, and I'll give you an opportunity to give me an experience. Here's the opportunity. I am looking for the lobby of a building somewhere in the world that is more impressive than BMI's lobby, because it is magnificent. I've never seen anything like it, and I've traveled everywhere. Is there a place in Zurich with a lobby that would rival that? Oh, come on, this is a rich city. There's a lot of money here. They just don't spend it on lobbies, I guess, right? Well, these companies made lots and lots of money for a long, long time by owning the studios and having the production facilities to make CDs and owning the channels to sell the music. And then their system was destroyed. Think of an asteroid coming down and hitting the ecosystem and wiping it out. The music industry has changed beyond recognition. And you can see it. In the 1980s, 3 or 4 big major musical acts that everybody listened to would come along every year. What do we have in the last 10 years? Lady Gaga, I guess. Taylor Swift, I don't know. There are 3 or 4, and that's about it. So the industry's been changed beyond recognition. So I went down in April to take some pictures at Music Row. This is what it looks like today. And I took about 15 of these pictures. I could put up another dozen, all within a couple of 100 meters of each other down on Music Row. That industry has completely been, whole parts of it have been wrenched out. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't making music and doing well. Lots of people are. They're just doing it a different way. The old way doesn't work anymore. And that's where we are in this world, where these devices, have begun to change the expectation of what people expect in the products that they use. And we aren't even done yet. What is it going to do to software when the device reads people's facial expressions and they have the ability to interact with gestures, their hands in the air? I don't know. But I know it will be different. And I know that we have to adapt to that change. I know that what we have done in the past is simply not going to get us into this modern world, because our tendency to look at software is just, let's divide it up into rectangles, let's cram something into every rectangle. And I'm going to get to the problem behind that in a moment. But that's not where we need to be. We need to be in an era in which software is fluid and works well. You guys have seen software that does that. Here's some. You guys ever looked at Zune? Zune's not bad software at all. Where things just kind of flow back and forth in a natural way. Notice that there's not a lot of rectangular things delineating everything. There's a lot of openness and white space. And I'm going to talk about some Gestalt principles that explain why they make all of these fundamentally the same size. This is a very natural flowing sort of software. Let me switch over and show you even commercial software is tending to get into that vein. This is a package that my team wrote about 4 years ago, back in 2008. And it is for temporary staffing. And I changed the password to front end this morning because it makes me change the password. It's real production software. This is the dashboard with the ability to expand and contract the parts that we don't want to see. Clickability so we can go to different parts of the app and back. Main screens that allow us to do Googlish kinds of searching. If I go for Gmail, somebody down there's got Gmail. I can go and look. Yes, there's a contact with Gmail. We can have things like visualizations of what do the charts for particular organizations look like, how are they held together. We can zoom them in and out. We can do editing with a somewhat better experience than people are accustomed to. If we edit, we can slide the foreground back a bit. I'm going to talk about the design principles involved there in a few moments. Gray it out. Work here. Go back when we're done there. Add little expandable elements. If they're not used very often, let them just sit there, and then we go to look at an employee, for example. We want to see a picture, perhaps. We might want to have a way to hover and get more information, depending on what technologies we're using. We can't do that in touch, but go over the picture, get more information. That's the kind of way that we can write applications today, but most developers have not entered that world. And so I want to spend the balance of my time trying to explain a little bit about how I think that they need to get there. How do they need to enter that world of better software? So I want to talk about some design principles. These are fairly fundamental design principles. I'm just going to drink the entire bottle here because I'm tired of pouring it into the thing there. I know it looks kind of difficult to make the kind of transition from a lot of the apps produced today to the kind of stuff I just showed, but I think it can be done if you take it in steps. And that first step is a foundation. It's to understand a little bit about design principles, because here's what you have to be able to do. It's not enough to look at a design and intuitively know if it's good or bad. You need to know why it's good or why it's bad. You need to know what makes it good, so you start out making better interfaces. If something's bad, you need to understand the principles that make it bad. Well, there are quite a number of these principles, these fundamental design principles. Let me talk about one of them called horror vacui. This is some fancy Latin for fear of empty spaces. Whoops. Yeah, you guys, is my Zune still up there? Let me get rid of my Zune. You guys should have told me that Zune was still up. Let me close it down now. Horror vacui, fear of empty spaces. Why is that important? Well, it turns out that we are accustomed to these screens that we cram everything on. You saw an example a few minutes ago. And I'm afraid that a lot of developers and even some designers don't really understand the implications of that from a psychological perspective. So let me give you a little test. I'm going to show you two pictures. They're both shop windows. I took them in the Mall of America in Minneapolis, Minnesota, one of the largest shopping malls in the world. Used to be the biggest. And I'm going to show each one for about 3 or 4 seconds. Here is the test. I would like for you to decide which shop you think is selling expensive, high-quality goods and which shop you think is selling cheaper, lower-quality goods. Do you understand your test? Okay. All right. Okay, so what do you think? Which one looked like an expensive shop? The first one or the second one? The first one? Would everybody pretty much agree with me on that? Well, I think that that's a pretty universal understanding, that if you look at a shop window and it's open, that says we're a very successful company. We don't have to cram everything in. This is just a sample of what we have. You should come on in and see more. Whereas the one with the cheap goods is saying, well, our goods are pretty cheap. If you don't see anything you like in the window, you probably just should keep walking down the mall. Now, here's the thing about it. I went to this mall to try to find a crowded shop window. I thought this mall has the best retailers in the world all gathered together. Let's find a crowded shop window. So I went looking. And these are the kinds of shop windows that I found over and over and over again. Even the Lego store has an open, almost empty shop window. It got to the point where even the mannequins were saying, no, don't put anything else in here. I had to go all the way to the third floor to find this. Now understand, these are some of the most savvy retailers in the world. If they do it for a reason. They understand the psychology of their customers. They understand that open is comfortable and makes people feel that there's quality involved, and that cramped means cheap. So that means that the psychological impact of this screen is that it's cheap software. And it doesn't matter if your team spent 40 million francs to develop it. It still feels cheap to the people who are using it. They would rather have this. They would rather have something that has that visual appeal, that connotes quality. Notice the white space that's involved here. We write align labels and we do other things to keep the space nice and open. You hear artistic people talk about, and graphic designers talk about white space all the time. But they talk about it as if it's just intuitively, obviously good to have white space. No, there's a scientific reason why it's good to have white space. People prefer openness. We evolved on the savannah. When it's wide open, that means there are no threats. There's not an animal about to eat us. If it's crowded, that means there are threats. There are too many things for our mind to keep track of. So that's the kind of psychological connotations that we do when we have crowded screens. Now, sometimes it's necessary. There are jobs and tasks in which you do have to have an interface that's extremely complex, but understand that means that the users must then be able to handle high cognitive load. And we expect that there will be long periods of training attached to such a situation. So yes, are there situations where we have to have pretty complex screens? In America, we do a lot of financial trading. Financial applications tend to be very aggressive about using space, but the people who use them are very, very highly trained and very specialized in what they do. So, horror vacui, I try to communicate to developers, don't be afraid to have something that's open. The average user can't assimilate all the things that you put on a screen like this. They simply can't do it. Even if they say they can. Here's the problem. The reason that people end up producing a lot of these kinds of screens is they go to the users and the users say, please just show me everything. Why? Well, there's two reasons. It used to be that it was slow to put another screen in front of them because of the limitations of our computer systems. Now it's very fast to do it. But more importantly, they want everything in front of them because they are afraid that if you put it somewhere else, they'll never find it. That you cannot give them a user experience that allows them to find the things they want at the time that they want it. They don't really know what they want, but they know they don't want it hidden because you give them no way to find it. or no way to organize it well. They don't, in essence, for most development teams, they don't trust them to give them a good user experience. Let's talk about some other design principles. You may have seen these in one of your classes at some point or another. Did you realize that they had implications for software development? Gestalt principles. The human visual system is optimized to see structure in relationships. This was from research by German scientists in the 1920s, which is where the word Gestalt comes from. I'm now in front of an audience that probably understands what that word means a lot better than I do. So, form, shape, structure. I'm not sure what the English equivalent. I don't think we have a good word. So we use Gestalt. There are several principles of design that flow out of that, collectively known as Gestalt principles. Proximity, similarity, common fate, continuity, enclosure, figure ground. Let's look at examples. Here is a set of stars. Do you see rows of stars or columns of stars in this arrangement? You see rows. Well then, how about this one? Do you see rows or columns? Really, it's the same number of stars in the same size array. You see rows in the first case and columns now simply because of the proximity of the items. And this has implications for software design. Look at a screen like this. You probably would initially think, well, there are two sets of radio buttons that I choose an option in. And that's not what the designer or person creating the screen intended at all. They intended to have 6 pairs of 2 radio buttons. I think they didn't use checkboxes because they wanted to force the user to choose something. But it doesn't look like pairs. It looks like 2 columns of radio buttons. I'm going to show a different version of that screen later, redesigned to be a little better. So Gestalt principles can apply there. Now, in addition to proximity, we have other principles such as similarity. For example, do you see rows or columns now? You see rows now? Why? It's the same as this one, where you saw columns before, except that the color has been changed. Proximity can be overridden by similarity of color or shape or size. Color is probably most powerful. Color will certainly get us some rows, but we can also group by shapes. We'll see rows if things are similar by shape. Even by size, we will tend to see groupings of things that are the same size. The Zune software used that in their menu system in the lower right. The things down there weren't grouped by any kind of rectangular element. They were just sitting there, but they were obviously related in some fashion because they were all exactly, precisely the same height. We can also use shape to get more complex groupings. And you've actually seen Gestalt principles in use in things like charting software, even if you didn't realize that that was the case. For example, proximity is used in this case to group the data from a given period. But then similarity of color is used to group data over a span of time. Understanding proximity principles or Gestalt principles in general is also helpful if you want to make something stand out, which has obvious implications for highlighting. For example, if I told you to find the triangle here, that's very, very easy. Or if I said, find the star that's a different color, you can instantly do that. What's happening is that your visual system is doing certain operations before your conscious mind ever gets the information from it. The retina accentuates edges, and then there is another part of the visual system that does what is called pre-attentive processing. It tries to organize those edges and group things and relate them in some fashion before it hands the information over to the conscious mind, which means if we use Gestalt principles to do a good job, we lower the cognitive load on the user. They're using the visual processing system to do things, and then they don't have to think about it so much. There's also the principles of continuity and closure. This again comes out of our the way our visual system works, and it's not too surprising that our visual system works this way. It's a simple matter of evolution. Your visual system is tuned to see that leopard right away, despite the fact that not all of it is visible, because the ones who weren't tuned to see the leopard right away were eaten for the leopard's lunch and didn't have any children. But this persists in various ways, so that we had this tendency, an unconscious tendency, to fill in gaps. We see a rectangle there, even though there isn't one. One of my favorites is this. There is no ball there, but your mind certainly fills in that there is one. There's nothing there but a few triangles with one curved edge. We see this in some of the newer systems. This is Windows 8. Notice that their icons tend to be very minimalist. Look at the camera in the lower right down there. There are not very many elements there, but your mind fills in the gaps and gets a camera out of that without any difficulty at all. Then there is the principle of figure ground. If you've ever done art, you'll be familiar with that. Your visual system chooses what part of what it's seeing to focus on. That's considered to be the foreground, the figure. That's where you get your attention. The rest is just kind of screened out. It's the background or ground. You've probably seen diagrams like this at one time or another. What do you see when you see that diagram? Faces? Vase? Some people see a vase, some see the faces. It depends which part did your brain decide was the figure and which part did your brain decide was the ground. And we have the ability to consciously switch between figure and ground. That is, we can change the assessment of which is figure and which is ground to some degree under conscious control. Well, notice that can help us maintain context in software. That package I just showed you, remember what we did when I went to the editing screen? At this point in the execution of the software, the main parent screen is the figure, the thing you were supposed to focus on. Then we have the ground that it sits upon with a little bit of three-dimensional effects so that to make it stand out. But when we go to a child screen, we shrank the foreground, the parent screen a bit, and put a gray cast on it. The gray cast is an example of a design principle called atmospheric perspective. That something that's gray like that is perceived to be further away. So those visual cues then cause the user to assume that that's now the ground. It's not what you're focusing on anymore. You have a new figure in the form of the child screen. And so, once they're done, we remove the child and then go back. We can also use common grounds for grouping. If I were to redesign that horrible screen before, this might be my first cut. First of all, we want to do something about our proximity, get the pairs of radio buttons much closer together. But in addition, we can use a common ground to group them. And I consider that to be a far more effective solution than drawing rectangles around each one, which tends to be a standard developer way of looking at it. As I said, Zune is a good example of where you see a lot of these things. Gestalt principle there, those are obviously related, size, etc. A great place, by the way, to study some of these things, if you want to look at Gestalt principles in action, I'll see later, is remote controls. I have a couple of pictures of those later. Then there's another design principle that has to do with how we arrange things. What do you suppose these buttons do? They what? They fix the seat position. How do you know that? There are no labels. Your mind maps those shapes onto the seat, and that's the design principle of mapping. That is right there. We know that works with the seat. We automatically know which part of it adjusts the part that we sit on because those elements, those control elements, are mapped to their corresponding analogs in the real world. That's the mapping principle. There are lots and lots of these principles. I should mention that I have a Pluralsight course that if you happen to have a Pluralsight prescription, I talk about this stuff for about 4.5 hours. And if you're interested, you can go there. One of the things that you'll see me do there is the next test that I'm going to show you, because the next step after learning design principles is to start analyzing things in the real world. Expose yourself to good and bad design. I have another test for you. You ready for another test? I'm going to show you a picture of an elevator panel that I took in New Orleans, Louisiana, at a very expensive hotel, actually. And I want you to see if you find anything on the elevator panel that you might comment on. If you got on the elevator with a friend, is there something you would see and say, would you notice this? Okay? And I'm going to leave it up until, at least 2/3 of you have discovered something. When you discover something, please raise your hand and hold it there so I can see how many people have found something interesting or notable about the panel. Are you ready? There's the elevator panel. We're about half. Come on, you people in the back. You're playing too. Come on, if I can get 2 more, I'll quit. 1, 2. Okay. So, who wants to tell me what they found? Yes? There's bad alignment down there. Yeah, that's not very consistent, and we'll get back to that in a minute. That's certainly true. So, what else did you notice? Missing floor 13. Absolutely true. In my experience, that is the first thing most developers will notice. It's that analytical left brain at work. There is a missing number in the sequence. And it's true. It is absolutely true. And as you point out, it's common in many hotels, especially in cities that have casinos, that people don't want to stay on floor 13. But that's not why I took the picture. I can find lots of panels that have no floor 13. And the alignment is a good point, but it is not the reason either. What? The numbers aren't on the buttons. Well, how do you know the numbers are not on the buttons? They might be. I can tell you that they're not, but there's evidence that they're not. What else did you see? Did you notice? Yeah. The mapping is bad. Yes, this elevator panel is another train wreck of bad design. And all those things are true, and no one has yet seen the thing that made me go back to my room and get a camera and take this picture. What? I'm sorry? Well, the star is normally indicative of the first 4. That's an American convention. Right over here? Yes. They should. The arrangement is bad. The alignment is bad. There are lots and lots of things there, and you still haven't seen what I saw. Yeah. It's not fingerprints. He has hit it. The G, right here, the paint is worn off. Now, let's talk about this. So notice what that means. First of all, a lot of people will spot the fact that the 4 is missing. And other people spot that the alignment is bad. There's all kinds of problems there. But this is unambiguous evidence of bad design. Because what it means is that 100 people a day are getting on that elevator and pressing a piece of metal that doesn't do anything. That's the sort of thing you want to tune your brain to look for in the real world. Why are people pressing that piece of metal, that placard? It's not the button. Someone pointed out the numbers should have been on the buttons, and they're not. They're on the placards. Well, it looks like a button. What do buttons look like in the real world? They're round. They've been around for hundreds of years. That's an example of a design principle called an archetype. It means that there are certain... It's not going here. Am I not on my thing? I'm getting low batteries or something. Oops, there we go. Back up. I think I got several clicks all at once. Archetypes. Certain things in the real world have a form that people expect. And furthermore, when people get on the elevator, they're not looking that carefully to see what they're talking to someone or they're handling their baggage or something. They glance. Do you realize how big the area of your visual system is that has high resolution? It's called the fovea. Do you remember that from biology? If you hold a bottle cap at arm's length, that is the part of your visual system that has high resolution. The rest of it is filled in by your brain to be a convincing fake. You don't really see it. If you've done the blind spot thing, right? That's one example. How many of you have done the video with the two basketball teams passing? You didn't even notice it, did you? For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'll give you a link to that later. I don't want to give it away. So there are reasons people get on there, they just glance, they don't have very high resolution, they see that, it's round, they think button, they press. Only when their finger begins hurting do they realize that they've made a mistake, and they then look at the panel, and yes, they eventually figure it out. They do eventually get to the floor they want to be on, but we have imposed more load on them in the design of this elevator panel than we should. And it does not have to be that way. Here, for example, is an elevator panel at a hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada, the Mandalay Bay. Notice that the placards here are not round, so they do not call to mind a button. Furthermore, they provide a small opening for the button to snuggle in. That's using the Gestalt principle of proximity. We know unconsciously that the placard and the button are related because of their proximity. Whereas, if we go back to the other elevator panel, we don't know that. Look at the button between the 4 and 5. It's equidistant. You have to look at the whole row to understand which one it goes to. Well, that's fine for you, but what about a blind person who gets on there? The placards have Braille, but if you found the Braille for 4, which button should you go to? So it doesn't have to be that way. This elevator panel does a better job. This elevator panel also illustrates an interesting principle. Let's see if you can spot it. What about this? Do you notice that is another area of well-designed, well-thought-out operation? Yeah. Yes. The commonly used locations, floors, are highlighted and bigger. Well, that's the ones that the casino wants you to go to now, isn't it? That's where you go to spend money. So, of course, they want to make it very, very easy for you to get there. And there's a design principle called Fitts' Law that says if an option is bigger, it's easier to locate and use. That's not all that Fitts' Law says. It says some other things as well, but that's one of the things it says. So that's a design principle there. As I mentioned, you can look at things like remote controls and do a lot of analysis there and understand how design principles are applied or when they're not. The basic idea is one of the steps, I think, in learning a little bit about how to participate in design is to observe good and bad design in the real world. When I teach a class on design, and I teach 3-day classes on this, I usually turn people loose in the building for an exercise with their cell phone cameras and charge them with going out and finding good design or bad design and emailing me the photographs. Well, you can do that. You don't need me to make you do that. Go look for good and bad design in the real world. And then if you do that, if you become attuned to that, and understand now, I'm not necessarily trying to turn all developers into designers. I just want you to understand the importance of design and learn how to participate in the design process. In particular, I want you to become unsatisfied with the kinds of things you've done in the past. I want you to look at this and feel revulsion. I don't want you to create systems that have 300 menu items on them. There are design principles that explain why that's wrong, and there are plenty of options to making it better. One of the things to understand about this is, because you're stuck in your ruts, because you're pacing around your invisible cage, see, we had restrictions in our older software, and out of those restrictions, we built a cage for ourselves. We got into habits based on older technologies. Our limitations are gone, but they talk about zoo animals. If you take the cage away, they still pace inside the bars of the invisible cage. That's what many people are doing now, and you need to force your way out of things like this. And it's not a problem of coming up with new designs. The problem is overcoming inertia. New designs for this, for example, I think of ways. I just went through this with a client, and we came up with about a dozen different ways that we could make that better. We could use favorites or recently used items, or we could base menus on roles, or we could have a find capability to locate the item that's needed. I don't understand why Microsoft didn't put a find on that ribbon in Office, because it desperately needs one. So there are lots of things you can do. But then maybe what you need is a completely different navigation or interaction pattern. Not just master detail this. There are timelines and cues and viewports. There are so many different patterns that you could be using. For mobile purposes, there's a great book called The Mobile Design Pattern Gallery. I recommend that book. It's excellent. And then you need to look at how you force yourself to walk out of the cage. That's the final step. Stop designing applications the way you've always done it. Now, how do you do that? Well, there are various approaches. I'm a big fan of what I call creativity or design rituals. That there are certain things that become associated with a different mode of thinking. For me, I carry these index cards pretty much everywhere I go, and I carry pencils. And when I get ready to do creative thinking about designing of user interfaces, user experiences, this seems to just feel right in terms of size for me. And I think, have a similar size here. And I use pencils because somehow pens don't work right for me in design. Pencils feel better. I didn't use pencils for 30 years until I picked them up about 4 years ago. And it's low investment. I scribble on something, and it's a bad idea, and I just throw it away and go on the next one. So if you have something like that, a different place perhaps, then you can get into a groove of creativity. Also, you want to do some constraints. You want to force yourself to look at design in a completely new way by saying, I'm not going to do it the old way. For an example of a constraint to help you look at it in a new way that I use in my class is to say, let's look at the last screen you worked on. Please sketch it out. Now redesign it. And you must incorporate this curved shape in the design in a non-trivial way. It can't just be an icon on a button. And now that you're forcing people to look at it differently, they will come up with more ideas. I have a little card game I give out in my class. These are printed on business card stock, so I can have a little deck. Like Monopoly cards. Do they play Monopoly here? You draw the card. Well, we do the same thing. And I tell people during design, draw a card that says, you've just acquired some users who are 6 years old. Modify your design to accommodate them. So that's an example of a constraint that you impose upon yourself. The basic idea is you want to explore a space of design. Most developers think of design as a single path. They have a prototype that they grind on. If I had to let you go out of here with just one idea, it would be this. Throw that concept away. You should always be looking at 2 or 3 or for different ways to accomplish the user experience that you want. And I can give you an excellent reason. That's kind of the last thing I tell you. Have you ever been in that meeting where you presented someone with a single screen that you had designed and said, please give me feedback, please help me understand? And now it breaks into a food fight over, well, this should be 3 pixels further over, and I don't like that color. How many of you are familiar with that meeting? If you do multiple ideas, you will never have that meeting again. See, you have asked people to give you feedback, and they're going to give you some, but you didn't give them any choices. You didn't give them anything to compare and understand the strengths of one or the other. So the biggest thing to break out of your cage is to build yourself a design funnel with lots of ideas, reject some of them, and take the best ideas to the user. All right. I think I'm about out of time, right? I could say more, as you can probably tell. But I'll stop here since I am out of time. Should I take questions, or should we call it quits?
If they're really interesting questions, but I mean...
We're right at the time, so...
Actually, we are 3 minutes over time, and people are waiting for coffee, I know. So I guess you will probably be around.
I will be here.
So he'll be around. Okay, so thank you very much, Billy.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And probably have to call security of the train system that now a bunch of people is coming and picturing every panel they see and send you tweets about it. So I'm looking forward to the party going there and like seeing discussions about panels. Yes, so we have a half an hour break. There is coffee in the entrance room, and then we continue.